In his new book, The 60% Solution, Rethinking Healthcare, author Todd Furniss breaks down healthcare problems and solutions to free the industry to do its job. There are 5 major constraints: poor use of primary care, inconsistent accounting and incompatible IT, hidden pricing, restricted health savings accounts, and hyperregulation.
Welcome to today's brief. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a conversation I had with my Uncle Jim. Now, for those of you who don't know, I have an Uncle Jim. Uncle Jimmy is my mother's brother. And I talk about Uncle Jim in my book, The 60% Solution, Rethinking Healthcare, because the book starts, for those who don't know, with a very tragic story about my mother and father being involved in a plane crash. This was the introduction of me into healthcare because it included me taking care of my mom, along with my sister and my grandmother and my Uncle Jim, for the months and years following her involvement in this plane crash. It's a commercial airliner. It happened in Georgia, and it still remains to this day the worst aviation accident in the history of the state. It was a terrible, terrible situation. And many people were killed immediately, and there were only a few survivors. My father was killed, my mother was not. But my mother went through an absolutely torturous period after the accident because she had third-degree burns in over 2/3 of her body and had over 100 major operations in Grady Memorial Hospital down in Atlanta, which has one of the best burn units east of the Mississippi. She then did her rehab at Emory University, also in Atlanta. And one of the reasons I've reached out to Sanjay Gupta to see if he'll please be a guest on my podcast is because he is credentialed at Grady and is also a professor at Emory. So I'd love to have the chance to talk to him about some of this. But the reason I'm mentioning Uncle Jim is because I had the pleasure of seeing Uncle Jim this week. He lives in Virginia Beach and I'm down in Dallas. But I had a chance to talk to him about a few things, and I said, Jim, I got to tell you, I was really worried about only 2 people when I wrote the book. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, who are you worried about? And I said, well, Jim, I was really worried about Berkeley, my sister, and you, because you are the 2 closest people to me, and were especially the 2 closest people to me at the time of that time period in my life. My younger sister Berkeley is almost 2 years younger than me, just a fantastic person and a teacher up in Virginia, and my Uncle Jim. And I said, well, Jim, I was just fearful that my recollection would be different from yours in the writing of the book. And I didn't consult anybody when I wrote the book. I just sat down like Schroeder at the piano and wrote the book. But I wanted to really get his perspective. He said, Todd, yeah, maybe our recollections were a little bit different, but they were minor and it was not something to be worried about. But I got to tell you, I was really impressed by the last chapter in your book. And it stunned me because I thought, well, that's interesting. What captured you, Jim, about the last chapter? And he says, what really resonated was not only the optimism that comes out of the last chapter, but also the idea that rules are in many ways the enemy of the exercise of judgment. And we find that all the time, where people are so rules oriented that they don't step out of the rule given the context in which they're trying to make a decision. This is the case not only in healthcare, but it's broadly across the United States. We talk about it, for example, with COVID vaccinations, where they're saying, okay, you have to get a vaccination. Well, what happens if they have a medical reason not to get the vaccination, or if they've already had COVID and they have natural antibodies, or they're of childbearing years and they probably shouldn't get the vaccination because they want to have a baby. So there are all sorts of reasons why that might not be a good idea, but the response is it's a rule. We're facing this right now with regard to the airlines. The airlines are saying, for example, that the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, is requiring that people wear masks on airplanes. And there's a discussion around the FAA mandating that people have vaccination passports or some proof of vaccination in order to get on an airplane. Well, again, that doesn't make sense in the instance where the vast majority of people have already been vaccinated. We're well over 50% now for adults. And if you think about it, we have another 10% that have already had the disease. And then another 10% probably easily who have a natural immunity. So the issue is not the same as it once was. And the idea of these mandatory requirements can be counterproductive. And so what Jimmy was, my Uncle Jim was saying was, hey, Todd, I'm really taken by this idea of rules being the enemy of judgment. Rules are helpful under certain circumstances, and they're really good for processes where they're routinized. But we always have to allow for the exercise of judgment to override the rule. There's a great story about the founder of Nordstrom's once being asked for the employee manual. And this is hyperbole or lore perhaps at this point, but the founder looked at the employee quizzically and said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "I need the employee manual," the employee said. And so as the story goes, he took out a business card and wrote down the back of it, "Do whatever's best for the customer." And he said, "Here's your manual." And that's where you have, the idea that a value, what do with is in the customer's best interest, is applied to the fact pattern before you, whatever the customer's issue is on that particular day, to make a decision. And it's in many ways very liberating and very clarifying. And it's why books like Bill Bennett's book, former Secretary of Education, The Moral Compass, is very helpful because it establishes a whole portfolio of values that are not only part of the Western civilization thinking, but also critical for decision making. And it guides us on how we do things. But the other thing that is, for me anyway, a little bit more interesting and amusing is that people take different things away from what we say and write and do. And I just want to say thank you to Uncle Jim for mentioning that. I'm flattered that he read the book, as I'm flattered that everybody reads the book. But I'm also grateful that he found something useful, even though he's not in the healthcare industry and he's kind of retired now. But he had a different takeaway, and I think there are a lot of good takeaways in the book for people to look into. Whether you're interested in a harrowing story at the beginning around a very tragic plane crash, or you want to dive into some of the peccadillos of healthcare, or you want to think about organizations and rules and judgment in a different way. All those things are available in the book, but also available hopefully in the podcast we do on a weekly basis. So thank you, and once again, everybody, for your support. Again, I would ask that you like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. We've got some really exciting guests coming up. I'm really absolutely over the moon to announce that we're going to have Senator Steve Daines on an upcoming podcast in the month of July. And we're going to talk about some really exciting things there. And we have other exciting guests too, but he's at the top of the list for me as an old friend. With that, I want to say thank you once again, and we'll look forward to talking to you next week.